Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to English 203, section 518. Today we'll be talking a little bit about writing your thesis statement, which is also due Saturday 9:20, the same time that this video lecture and the video Google Doc should also be due. Okay, so while we are talking about thesis statements, we have a Google Doc at the same time, so please answer, I think, around seven questions. Mostly catered towards understanding thesis statements and planning. So as many of you may have already written a lot of essays, you should also know that the very important aspect of an essay is a thesis statement. A thesis is a succinct statement of your most important overall argument, and in a literary analysis, a thesis usually makes a surface depth argument that indicates how the text is complex. So it's not enough to just summarize what's happening in the text. It's not enough to just talk about examples. You must have some kind of debatable claim that you want to make about the text in terms of a literary analysis. In general, a good thesis statement in a literary analysis will answer the question on a deeper level: what does this text mean, or what does a careful reading of this text uncover? So you're trying to ask questions that are in depth, and you're kind of answering that in your paper. So the literary analysis thesis statements might be different than thesis statements that you are used to, depending on what field you are coming from. In the literary analysis, thesis statements usually appear near the beginning of an essay, where they summarize and preview ideas that will be developed and supported in the essay's bodies. So I'm not sure what kind of background you are coming from, but in the introduction, the thesis statement must be very clear and at the beginning of the essay. It doesn't have to completely be the first sentence, but it should always be within the introduction paragraph. Clear statements of your arguments, key claim in a thesis statement, and topic sentences help your readers to keep your argument in mind and anticipate where it will go. So as we are developing our essays, and I let you know about how introductions should be organized, you'll notice that in the introduction body, you'll have the thesis statement, and you'll have a roadmap in which you will talk about what kind of body paragraphs you'll be talking about. So you'll have the topic, and then you'll say, I'll say 3 things about this. And by doing so, in each body paragraph, you'll have a topic sentence, and the topic sentence will say, I don't know, like, this paragraph will talk about Bertha and her hysteria. The second, and then maybe the second body paragraph, it will be about the topic sentence of Bertha and her violence. So this paragraph will be talking about Bertha and her violence. So the use of thesis statements and topic sentences clear up the organization of your essay and allow your readers to understand where your essay is going. So placing the thesis statement early in an essay allows literary critics to make complex arguments that readers nonetheless find relatively easy to follow. So it's not just easy for you to understand and read over your essay when you're proofreading, but it's also for critics and readers to understand where the paper is going, because we as people think that we are communicating effectively, but when we are writing, sometimes it comes off as scattered. So you have to be able to organize your essay even on the introduction level and in the body paragraph level. Your arguments should pique your readers' curiosity. Remember that readers should find your main arguments debatable. So foregrounding your thesis early is also a way to interest your readers. So, sometimes when you're reading something and you're just waiting for the author to just get to the point, well, when you're writing a thesis statement and when you're reading a paper, you should also be able to find it clearly. So get to the point, make your reader interested in what you're saying very early on. And why is a potential counter argument important? So not all introductions have to have a counter argument, but sometimes it's effective to have a counter argument before you introduce your own thesis statement. Because in an argument paper, the thesis is a statement in which you make a stand on a debatable issue. So a strong debatable argument has at least one valid counter argument, an opposite or alternative point of view that is as sensible as the position that you take in your claim. Because sometimes when you feel like you're very convinced by another person, the person is able to give a counter argument and then even say their own argument, and it makes their claim even clearer. So if you are able to find a counter argument that you think is valid before introducing your thesis statement, that is also another way that you could make your statement more valid. And I'll show you an example of what I did in terms of counter arguments, but This is only if you feel like you found a counter argument that is valid. Don't just try to make one up. If you feel like your thesis statement is strong as it is, that's fine as well. Okay. So you could, when you are brainstorming, have potential counter arguments in your head. So the point again is your arguments should pique your reader's curiosity. So you're trying to make the reader interested. So the counter argument also should be a sort of debatable and interesting point. So think of your thesis statements as starting a conversation with your reader. So you could start to think, what would people think about the red room? Are there potential counter arguments to that? What would the counter argument be? What would I think? What would we think of the controversial idea of St. John? Is he a very good religious figure? Is he a bad religious figure? If you argue that he's a good religious figure, you could say many critics have said he's a bad religious figure, or people may also assume that he's a bad figure. But you always have to support both claims though. So when the person is reading the paper, they should not be confused on which you're siding with. You should make it very clear that one is the counter argument, and the next is the thesis statement that you're trying to say. Even if you do not have a counter argument, as a writer and critic, you should try to anticipate these responses and answer them in your essay if you can. If your analysis ultimately satisfied the counter argument your readers begin to raise when they first encounter your thesis, you will have written a persuasive analysis. So if you are able to even rebut certain points that you think are valid and you want to make your claim even clearer, there are potentials to counter arguments. But again, this is only possible if you think it's necessary and you have a very strong rebuttal. So before you begin your essay, it's always important to brainstorm. So even with counter arguments, that's also part of the brainstorming, because you might have different ideas and you might think about the issue in a positive way, in a negative way, but you're kind of, battling with yourself. So when you are doing this, think of all the things that you thought when you were reading. So what part of the book was most interesting to you? Why? Which character was the most interesting to you? Why? Did any part of the book disturb you? Why do you remember it? Because sometimes you even write about things that you think are really disgusting, things that disturbed you, and it actually comes out as a very powerful paper. Did any part of the book emotionally move you? If you felt very emotionally moved by something, that's another way for you to kind of get out all the emotions that you felt throughout the book. And that might be a good point of time to start writing your essay. Think of questions that you had in your head. You may start from one of your discussion questions and start to think how you would answer that question. So I think I have skipped about 3 different points of questions on the Google Docs maybe, but one of the questions here is, take a discussion question that you have written in the past and start to think and answer one of the questions as a point of trying to brainstorm about a certain topic that you might want to talk about in the future for your essay. So take a discussion question from your discussion question board and answer briefly what you thought about that question. So you're writing a response to your own question. Another Google Doc question that I've put there is, how do you organize your essay? So organizing an essay is important because often we run out of things to say. When we are sorry, it's raining here. When we are amid writing a paper. So how do you organize your essay? Please write if you do organize your essay. If you don't, you can write that as well, but let us know what kind of technique you have in terms of organizing your essay. By also organizing and categorizing your ideas beforehand, your introduction will be much clearer when the reader reads your paper. So if you have a very organized plan, when you actually convert it into your paper, it'll clearly show that planning has been there beforehand, and it will allow the readers to read the paper very in an organized manner. Sometimes planning actually takes longer than writing. So you might be able to plan very clearly and then write very immediately because you know what you're doing. Okay, so that's the question, how do you plan your essay? So I'm going to just give a sample setup of planning your thesis statement. You can take this route or you can take another route, but it's always important to plan your essay. So the PLAN here I have put here is actually, it stands for something for each letter. So P is pay attention to the prompt and identify all the tasks. So this is where you're identifying how many things you have to do with your essay. You may even number how many things you will do, highlight, circle the important parts of the prompt. So for this particular prompt, it's just a close reading paper, so you don't have that many steps, but it's always important to pay attention to all the things that should be doing in an essay. So for my particular topic here, prompt here is choosing either Jane Eyre or White Sargasso Sea. You will write a close analysis paper with a clear topic and a thesis statement. You must have a common idea that you're heading towards. So you'll do several things, right? First, you'll choose either Jane Eyre or White Sargasso Sea. You'll choose a clear topic from Jane Eyre or White Sargasso Sea. So that's the second step. And then the third step is you will have a close analysis on that clear topic. And then you'll have a thesis statement. And of course, you'll have a common idea that you're heading towards. So these are all the things that you should consider when you are looking at the prompts. For me, from the prompts that I have put here, you don't necessarily have to do any of these. You can have your own. So the Red Room and Jane's Hysteria, surrogate mother-father figures, Victorian education, violence and discipline, religious implication, Jane's closure and escape, ideals of femininity, Jane's unreliable narration, marriage as violence, Jane's independence, Bertha and Jane, the battle of eroticism of Jane and Rochester. So you can choose any of these topics. You can choose another topic that you have already thought about. For me, I chose the idea of Bertha and what she may represent in the novel. So I'm starting out with a very narrow or a bit broad general idea of what Bertha may mean to me in the novel. And I'm also contemplating the idea of critics who have claimed that Bertha's portrayal in Jane Eyre is savage-like and unheroic. So I'm having that counter debatable argument there inside my head, like, okay, people have argued in the past that Bertha is not a very heroic and almost like a almost like a savage-like figure that just represents a kind of imperialistic other. So I'm having that I'm having that thought in my head, and I'm thinking, okay, what do I think about Bertha? So L, list the main ideas that you're going to talk about in your essay. So if you were to choose the topic of the Red Room and Hysteria, for example, what main ideas do you have in terms of the Red Room and Hysteria? So now I'm moving from what topic I thought of, and now I'm kind of starting to respond on that topic. So choosing any of the themes above, write a brief statement in response to what you think of. So this can be very general. You can have a certain idea of that Red Room and Hysteria. You can have a certain idea of Bertha. You can have a certain idea of what Jane is to you as an independent character, but you have to have a certain response to it. And you can list an array of responses here, but make sure to choose one after you've written them all. You choose the one that speaks more to you before moving on to the next part. So for me, I'm moving from what I thought about Bertha, and I'm moving from the topic of what Bertha may mean to me, and now I'm thinking Bertha serves as a heroic figure to Jane because she's able to save Jane from marital violence. So it's not purely that she's portrayed as this very imperialistic, negative figure, but she's also a very heroic figure to Jane because she's able to save her from a potentially very violent marriage. Now, A, add support ideas to address your main idea. So once you have decided what you think of it, so my position now is that Bertha serves as a heroic figure in the marital violence, right? This is where you attach supporting ideas to the statement you have written. This by no means has to be organized. You are just jotting down different places where you see evidence. It can be scenes, it can be techniques, whatever. So this is where you're kind of jotting down ideas like, okay, why do I think Bertha is a heroic figure? Why do I think Jane suffers from marital violence? So you're jotting down all the ideas that you think you've seen in the text. So I put examples like Bertha's desire to help Jane by getting rid of the wedding veil, and Bertha jumping off Rochester's house to death. What could death mean? Or violence against Rochester. So it's not just Bertha being violent to Rochester, but the way that Rochester actually imposed violence on Bertha, which is a fight back against Rochester, right? So I'm thinking of all these different examples that potentially could show Bertha as a kind of heroic figure that helps Jane out of that marital violence. Now, I know there are several questions here, so if you get the gist of what I'm trying to do here, kind of building upon the different ideas, there's several questions on the Google Docs, so please answer those on your own topic. And finally, notice the detail of your added ideas by highlighting which parts of the support ideas connect to your list of main ideas. So having all these examples put together, I'm going to say I'm going to show you what I wrote for my thesis statement, but first of all, I'm choosing the idea of Bertha and what she may represent in the novel. And I thought Bertha serves as a heroic figure to Jane because she's able to save Jane from marital violence. And then finally, I've had these different examples of Bertha's desire to help Jane by getting rid of the wedding veil, jumping off Rochester's house to death, and violence against Rochester. So I connect these things together and think, okay, maybe the violence that is already imposed is a symbol of marital violence that Jane and Bertha might have continued to have, and Jane and then Bertha desires to kind of help Jane because of this past marital violence that Rochester has given her, and thus she becomes a very heroic figure. So I'm kind of organizing the order of thoughts that I've kind of come to establish, and then I write this thesis statement. But before I move on to showing you my thesis statement, I want to make it clear that what should a thesis statement consist of? So first, it should have a central theme such as the Red Room or hysteria, feminism, imperialism. So it should have a central theme that you're responding to. And it's not always necessary, but if you can, you could start out with a counter argument, how critics or readers might have read this in the past. You don't have to do research for this paper, but you could argue that certain people might say blah, 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 but I think blah, blah, blah. So in direct contrast to the counter argument, you can now say what you want to say about the theme. And after you've kind of responded by saying the thesis statement that you wanted to say about the topic, that's when you're going to talk about what literary techniques you are going to use to show that. So you could say the reason Bertha's violence is not necessarily a negative one. She shows a very heroine-like figure towards Rochester by her physical fight for Jane. So show kind of the way or the imagery that is portrayed, or the fire or the symbol of fire. So choose what literary technique you're going to use to show the theme and topic that you want to show. And if possible, as a roadmap, you can also add another sentence in which you will guide the reader by saying 2 or 3 points you will be writing about in the paper. For instance, you could say you will be discussing 2 or 3 literary techniques or 2 or 3 scenes in the books to provide your main argument. So the roadmap is at the very end of the introduction paragraph in the future, and it would be showing what kind of things you'd be talking about in the body paragraph. So this is an example of a very old paper, but critics such as Spivak have argued that Jane Eyre's portrayal of Bertha Mason shows the limited portrayal of women in the age of imperialism. She argues that literature viewed women as purely as a source of childbearing and soul-making. I, however, disagree to her perspective of Jane Eyre that echoes imperialist sentiment of that period. And this is where my thesis comes. In this paper, I will argue that I saw Bertha to be a heroine, even within Jane Eyre, unlike Spivak, who claims that Y. Sargasso Sea is the only time she is portrayed as a proper human being. Bertha serves as a hero to Jane by preventing further marital violence that she herself faced by warning Jane of Rochester's violence. My argument can be, and this is where the roadmap comes in, my argument can be further accentuated by the depiction of violence of Rochester, the physical battle Rochester had with Bertha, and Bertha's guidance to the independence of Jane. So you can start with a counter argument if you want to, or you can contextualize it if you don't think that you're going to have a counter argument. For example, you could start out with contextualizing what you'll be talking about. So for instance, if you're talking about the Red Room, you could say there are many scenes in Jane Eyre about the Red Room that continues to reverberate throughout the novel, and that's why I will be talking about, and then you can establish why you think it is significant, and then write in response to that Red Room and what you think about the Red Room in terms of your own thesis statement, and then show at the very end, showing a roadmap of what things you'll be talking about in terms of Red Room. Okay, so that's it. And please write the final question on the Google Docs, what you might have discovered in terms of writing a thesis statement, what new things have you found out. So please write that out. And again, at the end, I want to say that the thesis statements, the proposals are not graded. I'm just trying to see if you're on the right path. So please submit it by Saturday, 9:20 a.m. It's in the writing folder, the one that says writing projects, and then it's in the first folder that says the midterm paper. So please submit that. It's really a participation grade, so if you don't do it, then I'm just gonna have to mark you down. So please just do the assignment, and I hope you have a really great weekend. So I'm going to stop recording, and please do answer the Google Doc.